So the Peter Khill case has ended, and it turns out that he was found not guilty of murdering John Stiers, who was a 29-year-old Indigenous man. This ended up taking place on it was February 4th, 2016, and what was said is that Kill ended up coming out, hearing a noise in the middle of the night. He ended up coming out with his shotgun, where he found Stiers rooting through his truck. And then he ended up confronting the man. The man turned around and he raised his hands to about gun height, or like waist level or something around there. As I can't remember exactly what it said, but pretty much it was that Kill ended up believing that Stiers had a gun, and he ended up shooting him twice, and then he ended up killing the man. So this trial began just a little bit after the Colton Bushi case, as everyone remembers that was a big deal inside of Canada. Many were saying that this was an example of how the Indigenous people are mistreated when it comes to trial, and the fact that Kill has been found not guilty and has been let off with no charges. This has also once again fired up a lot of those sentiments inside of the have fired up a lot of those sentiments inside of the Indigenous community. But as we look into this, and the media has also taken their own stance on it. They seem not too happy that Peter Khill ended up getting off, and they seem to think that he should have faced some charges for the murder of John Stiers. But I find that the media only takes a one-sided approach. They're really looking at this from only a two-dimensional direction rather than looking at it from all sides. Because as we see here, it's talking about, it says the case was being watched by Indigenous community leaders because it raises similar legal issues to the controversial case in Saskatchewan, involving the death of Colton Bushi, an Indigenous man. In that case, an apparent all-white jury acquitted Gerald Stanley of second-degree murder in Bushi's death. Now, they make that reference there. They say the all-white jury, but that's not actually it may have been, but that's not fair because for them to say, because they're leaving out a key important fact about that case. As we look over here, they say that half of Bushi's jurors were Aboriginal, and this was from a member of the jury pool. So as we look into this article, it says almost half the prospective jurors in the Colton Bushi case were Aboriginal persons, according to one member of the jury pool. However, the reason there were no Aboriginal Canadians on the jury is this controversial case is because so many deliberately opted out of the process. Other First Nation prospective jurors, meanwhile, were openly and outwardly biased during the selection process, according to one prospective juror who spoke to The Sun. So he's talked about on one side of the room, it was mostly a bunch of different people. And then he says on the other side of the room, there were maybe 3/4 of First Nations people, the person said, estimating approximately 85 to 100 of the initial 200 prospect jurors were Aboriginal. As a prospective juror described, some of the remaining 45 or so were vocal in expressing their bias and signaling to everyone in the room they were unfit to serve in the jury. You could audibly hear some of them talking amongst themselves, discussing how they were going to hang Stanley, or they were going to make sure he gets hung, or that if they don't get the results they want, they were going to handle it themselves. The thing that was most shocking to me was the fact that they were so audible from where I was sitting across the room, and there were police scattered throughout the room. No one stopped them. And this is something that they do not bring up in this whole Peter Khill case when they're making the comparison to the Colton Bushi case. Now, in that situation, there was a group of kids that they were going from farm to farm, and they were trying to steal stuff from those farms. And they made it on the way onto Stanley's farm, and when he ended up confronting them, he made the claim that he did fire, but he did not mean to actually kill the young man, Colton Bushi, that night. But the one thing about it was that they were trying to steal his car. What was left out is that they ended up assaulting his wife, and the fact that they were doing that throughout the night, going from farm to farm trying to steal stuff. This is not a first time that the farmers of Saskatchewan have this problem. But as we look more into it, Ava Hill, chiefs of the Six Nation of Grand River, said she and her entire community were shocked and left in disbelief by Wednesday's verdict, which she says is another example of courts failing Indigenous people. Well, we have to bring up the fact that Stiers was actually trying to rob this man's truck at the very time. Now, it is worth mentioning that we live in a liberal society, and one of the core principles of liberalism, as set down by John Locke, was the right to life, liberty, and property. Everyone should have the right to defend their property and not have it stolen from them. So this is a very important prospect, although we may have moved away more from that, but I think it's worth bringing up for the society that we do live in. She said it left Starr's entire family, especially the mother of his children, Lindsay Hill, a wreck. They're all in shock. They can't believe it. I can't believe it either. Is a truck worth more than a young man's life? Obviously, it is. Now, first of all, if this man Stiers has a wife and kids, then maybe going around and trying to commit robberies like this is not the best way to take care of your family. This is, my guess is he was probably going to try and sell it off or something like this, but there are plenty of other better ways to take care of your family than going onto farms and trying to steal people's trucks or the contents of their trucks in the middle of the night. And this is the thing, too. It was in the middle of the night, just like the Colton Bushi case. In both cases, the Stanley and Khill were in bed when they started hearing what was going on outside. And she says, is a truck worth more than a young man's life? Obviously it is. Well, no, it's really not. Like, we have to understand that all life is important to, even in this country. But the point is this is a man that was he was committing a criminal act, trying to steal from another person. When they're stealing this sort of equipment, this is their livelihoods too. So it's not so much that is the life more important, but it's more has to do with, does the individual have a right to defend their property? And at least when we're talking about this, I say yes, and apparently the jury says yes, that he does have a right to defend himself. And that doesn't mean that just because in both these situations they were indigenous, it has to do with racism. Although this is the way they're trying to describe it. But Hill did not agree, describing the verdict as racism rearing its ugly head again. Well, this is sort of been the new spin that they're trying to do in the court system, is they're trying to bring the race into it a lot more. Not so much that the jury is racist, but they're trying to make it that just whoever the victim is in the situation, or whoever is on trial of the situation, their race should be taken into consideration. This was something I also covered a little while ago, which was talking about how a black man who was on trial, and he'd been in and out of the system for a long time, his lawyer was trying to argue that the fact that he was black and all of the systemic racism that he had faced throughout his entire life, this means that he should not go to prison for nearly as long as if he was a white person. This is sort of the problem that we have in our society right now. I was hoping that it's not seeping in so much, but as more and more I'm watching these high-profile court cases, I'm starting to see how something like this is now a big deal amongst everybody. And we go on to another one where we're talking, no guilty verdict for Peter Khill shows Canada's justice system is still broke after Bushi, says Chief. But defense lawyer says court attempt to address racism could be the model for future cases. You can absolutely bet that it will be the model of future cases. Though, I mean, we're supposed to live in a society where we don't judge people based on their color of their skin or their culture, but we're supposed to be colorblind where we base them on their actions. And this is the way I think that the jury went about it when they were making their decision. They based it on the actions of the individual, not where he came from. So they're living up to the sort of beliefs that someone like Dr. Martin Luther King wanted. He full out said he didn't want his children to be judged based on this. The fact Peter Khill is free after admitting he shot and killed a First Nations man is further proof Canada's justice system is broken and continues to fail Indigenous communities, according to Chief Ava Hill. Well, I'm not sure what exactly this chief wants out of this whole situation. I mean, does she want her people to be able to commit these sort of crimes and get away with it regardless of whether they're caught or not? I mean, she hasn't put any, from what I've heard, hasn't said anything about the fact that he was committing a criminal act and trying to steal this person's truck. And granted, it was a 15-year-old truck, but still, the point is that it's somebody else's. And she has never brought this up once. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, this is the same person that we're discussing over here from the previous article. Let's see here. Yeah, it is. So in these two different articles, they've addressed the same person about the situation, the case that has gone on, but they haven't really gone out and spoken to anybody else. And the other thing is, too, is that even it says right here, is that Khill was a former Canadian Forces reservist. So the defense that people were making, and I think it's a fair one to make, is that his training kicked in when he ended up hearing this situation go on. This is something that ends up happening whenever you're put into a dangerous situation. If you have the appropriate training to defend yourself, is that you sort of not so much tune out, but you let your training take over. This is something I've heard from several different people, and some of them I've actually spoken to directly, where they speak about their training taking over if ever put into a dangerous situation, because that is what the training is for. So, and again, we're making comparisons to the Bushi case. It says Bushi, a 22-year-old from Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, was shot and killed on August 26 by Gerald Stanley, a white farmer. A reportedly all-white jury reached its not guilty verdict for Stanley. The decision led an outrage across the country and pledged from federal minister and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to change systematic issues in the justice system. This was a bad decision to make by our politicians, because they are trying. The whole point is to have the executive body of both the executive and the legislative body of our administration, of our current government, to be separate from the judicial body, which is the court systems. Because whenever you have the executive, more specifically the executive, but also the legislative body, whenever the executive is starting to take control of the judicial body, then you're really getting into a dangerous situation. This is actually one of the main one of the main symptoms of when you're entering the dictatorship. I'm not saying we're there now, but we have seen from the past that Trudeau kind of likes that idea of a dictatorship. He's mentioned that about China. And he's tried to sort of move that way ever since he's become prime minister. He thinks it's a great idea. But so this is actually a dangerous proposition for any of them to be making when they say that the courts are wrong and we're going to make sure that we change that, so that way if ever in the future the courts want to make this decision again, they won't be able to. But this is why I just feel that a lot of people, as it's being presented, or at the very least the way the media right now is presenting it, maybe more, it would be safer to say more specifically CBC, they're presenting it in a one-directional situation. They're not really taking into consideration all the facts. They're really just trying to come from a narrative point of view. They want people to change the idea of the way people are. And the thing is, too, is actually maybe it is a little lower in here. They're talking about jurors being screened for racial bias. They ask them, are you racist? But now they're starting to suggest that questions aren't enough. But even the questions became standard practice. Hill said she doesn't think simply asking someone if they're racist is enough to ensure Indigenous Canadians will be treated fairly. How do you prove that? I can ask you if you're racist, and you can say no. The whole thing, I think, just racism rearing its ugly head, as she was kind of saying before. But this is, again, we're talking about protecting the private, protecting property down here. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is many of these people are saying, well, why didn't you call the police? You should have called the police to handle it. There have been numerous situations, especially when we're talking about the more rural areas, where people bring up the fact that the police, it can take them 20 minutes, half an hour to get out there in an emergency situation in comparison to the city, because they have stations all around. But in the rural areas, they don't, whether it happens to be firefighter, paramedics, or police. So this is a bullshit type of defense that they're trying to do, but they're just pulling up all the stops for this court case, because they really, as hard as they're working very hard to try and change the narrative and change the court system to match their idea of a progressive world, to match their social justice world. And it's very dangerous when it's the court systems that they want to change, because it's I don't know about you, but in a future situation, if anybody was put in a similar circumstance, I don't think it's going to turn out nearly as well for them. And that's just for the sole fact they're trying to protect their property and their family. All right. Talk to you all soon.